Hey everybody, welcome to the forms update for the new buyer and seller agreements that are being released on December 4th, 2024. For those of you who may have taken this as a class earlier in the year, there was CE credit. However, this recording does not have CE credit to it. So we get started here. My name is Jess Peck. I'm the Director of Member Engagement and Professional Development with VAR, and I wanted to go through the new forms with you and do a quick update to let you know what was changing. Just to review the antitrust statement quickly, we will be reviewing documents that do talk about compensation and commission, but we aren't going to be talking about specific fees or anything like that. Those are things that you and your office are deciding on and not something that we will be going over in this class. Since we released the addenda this summer when Prime MLS did the update to their rules based on the NAR settlement, the Forms Committee has been working relentlessly at updating the buyer and seller agreements to comply with the NAR settlement along with the various other moving pieces that we have to work with. So what they looked at was the NAR settlement, the Real Estate Commission administrative rules here in Vermont, the NAR Code of Ethics, and then of course the boots on the ground, what needed to be done for the agents here in Vermont, what was needed for how real estate is actually practiced here. So the Forms Committee worked very hard on these forms. It did many, many rounds of updates. The forms then went to the Exec Committee with VAR and then ultimately with the VAR Board of Directors and went through approval that way and is now making it to the members for release on December 4th. So there were several overarching changes that were made across the board to these documents, which you'll actually see in documents that are released in the future as well. First and foremost, we did some updates to the font and formatting. Font got changed to Calibri in a size 12. We had a much smaller size font before, which I believe historically was done because people didn't want these documents to expand to multiple pages, and instead the font just got smaller when things were added, which especially because things are done digitally nowadays, the number of pages really doesn't make as much of a difference. So we really needed to bring it up to a standard size 12 font. And we did some standard margins as well. This is just a quick view as to how that looks, just the first page of one of the agreements, how it looks with the old font and formatting versus the new font and formatting. And you can see just by glancing at the change overall, how much more readable it looks. It doesn't look quite so daunting looking at it with this little tiny font. The other thing that we looked at was the language that was being used. Sometimes it was owner, sometimes seller, purchaser, buyer, commission, fee. We really tried to standardize that across the forms. And that again will move into other forms as further updates are done to have a more consistent feel across all the forms with the language that's being used. Forms Committee also worked at removing some of the redundant information that was there and simplifying the language so it was less legalese. One of the other changes that was made was removal of the limitation of liability clause. As you remember, this clause was removed from the purchase and sale agreement a couple of years ago because it involves the real estate agent, and the real estate agent is not a party to the purchase and sale, but it is now being removed from the buyer and seller agreements as well. And what happened here was this was something that was coming up more and more in legal battles that we were seeing. It has come up in the Chapter 57 review that OPR has put out, and just more and more talk about this has come up. And so the exec committee with VAR brought this up and asked that VAR legal counsel give us an opinion on whether this should be in our agreements or how, where this stands. And what we were told by VAR legal counsel was that in business to business situations, a limitation of liability clause is fine. It works well. But in a business to customer situation, which is what we're dealing with, that courts often throw this language out and that it is not enforced. And that's because as a business, as a realtor who is doing this day in and day out, we are viewed as having an advantage in this situation because we have more knowledge about the process in these documents than the average customer who is not doing this as on a regular basis. So this has been removed. Now, this clause is still available as a clause in the clause library in dotloop and our other forms providers. So if you want, just like we did for the purchase and sale, if you wanted to add it back in as an addendum or in one of the other, empty fields in the agreement, you could do that if you chose to, but it's not going to be boilerplate within the agreement now. So we wanted to tell a story. A lot of times when we were just going through the buyer or seller agreement, our old buyer and seller agreement, we were jumping around a lot in order to kind of keep up with how we were explaining things. Because commissions weren't, commission information wasn't all together, different disclosures weren't all together, and that sort of thing. So we really wanted to sort of have things laid out in a way that was comfortable and what the natural flow of conversation would be, and to have that similar on both the buyer and seller agreement, so that regardless of which you were working with, it was a similar sort of layout and conversation that you were having with buyers and sellers. So the first document we're going to look at is the exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. We're going to look at the designated agency version. I will point out the two paragraphs that are different in the non-designated agency version. We will be releasing the exclusive buyer agency agreements at the same time, but I'm not going to go through those specifically because they are used less than the exclusive right, and the exclusive right will cover most of the paragraphs that are being changed. So the story for the buyer agreement, looking at what type of property are they looking for? Who are we hiring? What is the compensation? How can that get paid? The agent's responsibilities, and then other various disclosures we need to make. So the first paragraph of this agreement goes through the type of the property sought by the buyer. And we really didn't change anything in this paragraph. We just moved stuff. Things were kind of blocked side by side before. We moved things so it was just sort of flowed up and down, through the section here, but no real information was changed. The next part of this is the grant to exclusive right to represent buyers. So this is where you're listing the agency that is being hired. So no big changes here. There were a couple sentences that were moved from other paragraphs that made more sense in here, as far as the agency using reasonable skill and diligence, and that the agency has no authority to make offers or agree to any terms or conditions on behalf of the buyer. This next section, you'll see the big block here in red. Though that really didn't make sense for this section because we were talking about the designated agency and who the designated agents are. So that bottom part was pulled out and made into its own sections talking about conflict of interest and confidentiality. So we'll get to that in a moment. So this really consolidates into a much smaller section talking about the designated agents, who they are, and of course those cannot be added to or changed without agreement. The next section for this is the compensation to the buyer's agency. So we added 3 specific sentences into this that came right from the NAR settlement, and that is brokerage firm commissions and compensation are not set by law and are fully negotiable. The compensation due to buyer's agency shall be clear, objectively ascertainable, and may not be open-ended. And the buyer's agency shall not receive compensation that exceeds the amount or rate agreed in this agreement. So that gets added into this section, but you'll see, the line for a percentage fee. A fee as determines as follows, which is a set fee or some other information, and then the additional compensation addendum if you have one to attach. The next part here, this used to be sections 5, 6, and 7 that talked about how this fee can be paid. So we combined these and took out a bunch of extra information to make it more simple. So it goes through how can that compensation be paid? So A, it can be paid with a cooperation agreement with the seller's agency. So if the seller is offering compensation to the buyer's agent, they can do a cooperation agreement, and it can be paid that way. B, the seller can pay the buyer's agency fee under an offer to purchase. So if the seller, if you don't know if the seller is offering compensation to the buyer's agent, or the compensation isn't as much as what the buyer would like to offset your fees or that sort of thing, you can put that fee in the offer and see the buyer to pay the buyer's agency fee. So whether that is because the seller is not offering compensation to a buyer's agent or whether the buyer wants to make their offer more attractive to the seller, whatever the case may be. Now, it can be a combination of these as well, as long as everybody knows. So if the seller is offering some compensation, but it's not the full amount that is in this agreement, the buyer can pay the difference or that sort of thing. As long as everybody knows, that is completely fine. The next part here is the buyer's agency fee as far as expiration and termination. So again, we took out a bunch of redundant information in here. Section A goes into if this agreement expires while the buyer is under a purchase and sale agreement and just states, that the buyer's agency is still entitled to the fee, whether or not this is renewed. And then section B about what happens if there is some procuring cause that may be in here in that tail or carryover period. Now, we did make a change in this that's important to note, that this does now have days instead of months for what that carryover agreement is. As things were being reviewed, it was realized that usually when we're filling in a blank like this, it is not months. Days is the more standard time frame that we're dealing with. So we did change this to days. So if you're used to putting in 3 or 6 for 3 or 6 months, make sure that you're paying attention to that because 3 or 6 days is not going to get you very far. The next section here is confidentiality. So this was part of that big section where we talked about the designated agents, and this was pulled out as its own section. So talking about confidentiality and that those designated agents are going to hold the information confidential about the buyer, with the exception that if they need help from their supervising licensee in their office, then they can disclose that confidential information as long as the supervising licensee doesn't have their own conflict in this situation. But they can disclose that information if they need help. This paragraph does not exist in the non-designated agency version of the agreement because everybody in the firm represents that client. So we didn't have to specifically call out information for a supervising licensee. The next section is conflict of interest. So again, this was pulled out from that big paragraph that talked about the designated agents. And this just goes through that the state of Vermont prohibits dual agency and that the buyer's agency works with both buyers and sellers. And if this buyer becomes significantly interested in making an offer on a listing that this designated agent has, either the listing agreement or this buyer agreement needs to be terminated. So this is where you would discuss what your office policy is as far as which agreement takes precedence in that kind of situation. Marketing materials, this was added a couple years ago to the agreement. We just did a little minor adjustment to some of the language regarding the agencies and agents not having any liability or responsibility from their inability to remove marketing materials from the web. The interest on the purchaser's contract deposit, all the information in this stayed the same. We took out a little bit of redundant information. We also took out the last sentence, which had to do with when you enter into a purchase and sale agreement, if the interest is expected to accrue more than $100, that folks can make agreements as to how that's handled differently than sort of the boilerplate handling of that. But because that's in the purchase and sale agreement already and only applies when they get to that point, that was removed from the buyer agreement and the seller agreement. We'll see that later on. Non-discrimination and fair housing, we just moved some of the sentences around in here to it read, so it's a little less clunky when you read through. We also realized that we were missing one of the protected classes in Vermont, a victim of abuse. So we added that in so that all of the federal and state protected classes are listed in here. Tax and land use permits, Really no huge changes in here. We did add the Vermont property transfer tax to be listed as one of the taxes to be aware of for buyers. As we know with the changes that are made, especially if they're buying a second home, that can be a very significant part of their closing costs. We wanted to make sure that was listed here for conversation. A new section that was added based on the NAR settlement was a wire fraud advisory. We know a lot of you probably have this in your email signatures, but not everybody reads through all those email signatures because they can get kind of long. So we wanted to have this in here just as an extra reminder to buyers that they really need to exercise extreme caution when wiring funds, that fraud is out there and happens, and they just need to be extra careful about that. Another new section that was added based on member comments and the NAR settlement is surveillance systems. Again, when you're going to show property, you're probably having these conversations with your buyers about the possibility of there being and probability of there being, Google Home, Amazon devices, Ring doorbells, whatever it happens to be within that home, and being cautious about what they're saying when they're in there and having those conversations with their realtor once they leave the property. The dispute resolution system did not change at all. This stayed the same. Term of agreement stayed the same. We just clarified the 12 in a word versus just the number that was in there for the maximum period that this agreement can be. Modification and amendment, we renamed this. It was originally called all amendments to be in writing, but we changed it to modification and amendment to match how the purchase and sale reads. And this got down to a simple one-sentence line that this agreement and all modifications, amendments, and changes thereto shall be in writing and signed by the buyer and buyer's agency and may be signed electronically. Short and sweet. Another new section that we added was the release of information. So this states that if it's requested, the buyer consents to the release of a copy of this agreement to their attorney, financial institution, mortgage lender, or MLS. So if Prime MLS gets a complaint and reaches out to you and says, hey, we need a copy of your buyer agreement within 24 hours, now you already have permission to share that. Same if they are getting a VA loan. Now these agreements need to be part of that loan package. And there are some other lending products and stuff like that that may be requesting this now. And another new section at the end here, we just added an additional terms and conditions with a big blank box. So, if you needed to add in the limitation of liability clause and you chose to add that in here, you had additional information about specific properties that were being covered under this agreement, or additional information about compensation. You have room for whatever you need to put in here now. And then, of course, the term of the agreement. This didn't change. So now we'll move on to the exclusive right to market property agreement. Again, we're going to look at the designated agency version. I'll point out those same two paragraphs that are different for the non-designated agency, and we are releasing the exclusive agency marketing agreements at the same time as everything else on December 4th. So the story for this agreement: what property are they selling? Who are they hiring? Who are we cooperating with? What is the compensation? Remember, cooperation and compensation are two separate things. Agent responsibilities, owner's disclosures, how are we marketing the property, and then other various disclosures. So the first piece here, in our old agreement, section 1 and 2, both had to do with describing the property. So we've combined those into one. So A has the type of property, B, homestead, non-homestead, and then we get into those other details like the deed, span number, and that sort of thing. Now, all of these don't need to be filled out, but of course, the more you can fill out, the better it is in any kind of agreement or MLS or anything like that. The next section here is the grant of exclusive right to market to listing agency. So this is where they're listing the listing agency they're hiring. Just a couple modifications, clearing up some language here for redundant information. We also moved a little bit of language around so that we could make that line for the listing agency name all on one line and as long as possible. We know there are a lot of really long office names out there, and we wanted you to have plenty of space to do that without abbreviating or truncating or anything like that. Again, we go into here who is that is a designated agency firm and who the designated agents are. And that big section that you see in red here again was moved into the conflict of interest and confidentiality sections that we'll see later on. So this section now just lists who the designated agents are, and again, that this can't change or be added to without everybody agreeing. The listing agency authority, we took out, again, some redundant information in here. And so it really just comes through that the owner authorizes the listing agency to list the property for sale or exchange, to advertise, show, and market as the listing agency deems appropriate, and then help them negotiate and all of that. And again, that the listing agency has no independent authority to accept or agree to any offers on the owner's behalf. Sections 8, 9, and 10 used to have to do with cooperation and a little bit of compensation and information in there. So these kind of went completely away, and we reworked all of these into the cooperation section and then the compensation section as well. So we'll start with the cooperation. So listing agency is authorized to offer, accept, and enter into agency cooperation agreements with other agencies. There are two types of cooperating agents: buyer's agents that are representing their buyer clients, and broker's agents that represent the listing agency with unrepresented buyer customers. And then there's checkboxes at the end here as to listing agency does or does not cooperate with buyer's agents or broker's agents. We know there are some agencies out there that do not cooperate with broker's agents in particular. And in light of making things very transparent and very upfront in explaining everything to our clients, the Forms Committee felt that it was important that this was disclosed if this was a practice of the listing agency. Now, keep in mind these last two checkboxes here are not talking to your seller to see what they want to do. This is where you, for your listing agency, are checking off what your listing agency policy is as far as cooperating or cooperating or not cooperating with buyer's agents and broker's agents. So you'll want to be able to explain that to your client if you are not cooperating with one of those and how that may affect them. Our next section here has to do with compensation, and I'll zoom in on a particular section in here as we dig in a little bit more. So again, with compensation, we start right off the bat. Brokerage commissions and compensation, the fee, are not set by law and are fully negotiable. You then have your line for a percentage or a set fee for the compensation, or a fee is determined as follows, you have as well. And then we dig in a little bit into more specifically any compensation that is being offered to cooperating agents. So we start off, owner acknowledges that offering compensation to cooperating agent is not required. It's not mandatory that they do this. And then we have checkboxes that the owner authorizes. Either the owner authorizes offers of compensation to a cooperating agent, in which case you'll complete section A or B, or owner does not authorize offers of compensation to a cooperating agent, in which case you'll skip those because there'll be nothing to fill in. Now, a side note here, in dotloop, we are making these radio buttons so that when you are completing this in dotloop, the first part here, the owner authorizes or does not authorize, only one of those will be able to be checked off at a time. And then sections A and B will be connected as well. So only either A or B can be checked off at once. So you can't accidentally check off both of them. Now, as we get into A and B, A is sharing the compensation. So whatever you put for compensation up above would be shared with the cooperating agent. And then you could fill in the percentage or the set amount to a buyer's agent or broker's agent. Section B starts to uncouple this fee. So it is not being shared from up above. What you have up above is just coming to you as the listing agency. And then there's an additional fee if the owner is authorizing offers of compensation. This additional fee that would go to a cooperating agent, either a buyer's agent or a broker's agent. So that would be uncoupled. It would be completely separate from what you are getting as the listing agency. So if you were still going to share the total compensation, then you're going to be using A, which is the way it was in our old agreements. But if you want to sort of decouple those, which some agencies are already doing, which is why we felt it was important to be in this agreement, as well as giving multiple options for clients, it can be split out and completely separate from the listing agency fee. This also, Section B works well if, for example, your fee as a listing agency is a percentage, but the fee being offered to a buyer's agent or broker's agent is a set dollar amount, because those are kind of hard to add together to equal what a total is to have things shared out. But that would be, how this is handled. Again, if you're going to keep doing the shared compensation model, that's going to be Section A here. The other thing that we had added to this section as a whole down below is a reminder that whether or not the owner has authorized compensation to a buyer's agency or broker's agency, the owner acknowledges that an offer they get may contain a request for compensation. So even if your seller says, no, I'm not offering anything to buyer or broker agencies, if they get an offer, there may be something, the buyer may be asking for the seller to offset part of their responsibility to pay their agent's professional fee. And this way the owner has a heads up on that and hopefully isn't angry at you if an offer comes in and states that, because you've had the conversation that might happen. The next part here, expiration and termination. Again, we took out a bunch of redundant information that was in here, but it really flows through with the same details. However, again, we did change that months into days for that carryover or tail period for potential procuring cause issues where you would still be owed compensation. Next section, confidentiality. This is the same that we had in the buyer agreement. So going through that the listing agency and the designated agents will keep information confidential, with the exception as if they need to go to their supervising licensee for help, provided that licensee doesn't have a conflict. And again, this section does not exist in the non-designated agency versions, since everybody in the firm represents that client. Conflict of interest, again, same that we had in the buyer's agreement. State of Vermont prohibits dual agency, and that the owner understands that the listing agency works with both buyers and sellers. So if they have a buyer that becomes substantially interested in this property, they need to either terminate their buyer agreement or the listing agreement, and you can have that conversation as to which takes precedence. Owner disclosures. These were kind of all over the place before. Lead paint had its own paragraph, but also had something in the marketing options. So we really brought these all into one place. So we have listed the owner disclosures that might exist. So we've got the lead paint disclosure. So, if the property is pre-1978, the property may be subject to lead paint regulations. So we've got the check boxes for that. We've got the note about the mandatory flood disclosure. So remember, that is something that every seller in Vermont needs to do. And just a reminder that form exists and needs to be done here. And then seller's property information report will or will not be provided. And then this last part here, we didn't want to make it letter D because it's not something that's typically done at the beginning of a listing. It's something that's done at closing. But the Forms Committee felt that it was important to remind folks about this, and that's the smoke and CO detectors. So the note that properties are required to have smoke and CO detectors installed per state law, so you can direct them to the Vermont Fire Safety as to, looking at the chart to see exactly what they need for that. And that a signed disclosure stating that these are installed and working will be signed at closing. Accuracy of information. We took out some redundant information on here, and the owner, again, is, telling us that to the best of their knowledge, all the information that they provide is complete, accurate, correct, not misleading, and that they're not hiding material information. This was all already in there. We just took out some of the redundant information. The next one goes marketing options. So some of this came out, because it had things about lead paint in there, which didn't need to be in here. And then we reordered it so it flowed a little bit better. All of the MLS stuff was together, and that sort of thing. So it comes down to here. And we start off with A, which is the owner does or does not grant listing agency permission to put the listing in MLS. And we expanded this section to explain that if they say no, that based on the clear cooperation rule, they say, no, it's not going into MLS, that means there is no public marketing. It means no signs, no electronic advertising, no flyers, no email blasts, nothing out on websites, nothing out on real estate apps. To make it really clear, that if they are choosing for it not to go into MLS, that means all of that's not happening as well. The next one we had before, does or does not authorize the owner's name to go into MLS. We talk about, can a cooperating agent show the property without the listing agent being present? Disclose to cooperating agents the existence, of course, not the terms, but the existence of a offer on the property. Place and maintain a lockbox, take photographs, place and maintain a sign. And then at the bottom for H, again, at the end here, we just have an open box where you can fill in more information if there's other things that you want to add. Marketing materials, we made the same changes we did in the buyer agreement. So just clarifying a little bit of the language that was in there. Interest on contract deposit. Same thing we did on the buyer's agreement. So we took out some of the redundant information. We took out that sentence that had to do specifically with the purchase and sale. If the contract deposit was expected to accrue more than $100 interest, how that could be handled differently. We took that out because, again, it's in the purchase and sale agreement. The second paragraph here talking about how a forfeited deposit is handled stayed the same. Taxes, we took out, again, some of the redundant information here. Reminder about the taxes that the seller may be responsible for. If they are a foreign resident, the FERPTA tax. If they are not a Vermont resident at the time of closing, the Vermont non-resident income tax withholding, and then of course capital gains, land gains, that sort of thing, if that applies to them. Permits, again, we took out some of the redundant information that was here and added that reminded folks that if they are subject to disclosures for Act 250 that they need to provide, that they need to do that as well. Non-discrimination fair housing. Again, same thing that we did in the buyer agreement. We reordered this a little bit so it flowed a little bit better, added in victims of abuse as a protected class because that was missing before. So we have all of the federal and state protected classes listed. New section, wire fraud. While it's not as common for sellers to be wiring funds for a closing, it's not unheard of. So we have this section in here as well to remind sellers of potential wire fraud issues. And again, surveillance. So we're reminding sellers that there are potential legal ramifications to them streaming and or recording audio and video of people at their property, and that they should seek legal advice before doing that. There's also a checkbox for is or is not present for surveillance equipment. We know this is in the SPIR as well, but since that is not a mandatory form, we did add it in here so you could gather that information. Term of agreement, we just removed reference to an old section that was taken out that didn't need to be in there anymore, but everything else stayed the same. Dispute resolution, again, stayed the same. Modification and amendment, same thing we did in the buyer's agreement, short and sweet, that all modifications, amendments, and changes have to be in writing, signed by owner and listing agency, and maybe signed electronically. And again, the term of the agreement. So these forms are going live on Wednesday, December 4th, 2024. They will be in dotloop. Hopefully they will be in our other forms providers that day as well, SkySlope, ZipForms, DocuSign. We don't have quite as much control over those, and those can be a little slower. So those form providers do have the forms, and they will hopefully go live on the 4th, but they will be in dotloop on the 4th for folks. And then just a reminder that we do have a form suggested mocks on the VAR website. So under the resources on the VAR website, you can go to form suggestions. You can suggest new forms that you think we should have. You can suggest changes to existing forms, and we will, update you as those are reviewed by the forms committee and let you know what's going on with them, if those changes are going to be done, or if not, what the reasoning behind that was. So that is it for these forms. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the winter season here. If you have questions about these forms as they go live and you're using them, please reach out to me. Please reach out to the VAR office, reach out to one of the members of the forms committee. We are all happy to help you navigate these forms or direct you to forms that you're looking for. Thanks so much.